Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the beautiful film. It was honestly such a pleasure to watch this because I was working on quantum listening, and it was wonderful to see some of the things that I already knew and then all these things that I didn't know, which were really moving, and perhaps we'll move on to that. But before this event, I said, oh, I'll send around some questions to Daniel. And Daniel said, no, don't do it on my behalf. Life is a grand improvisation. Well, you didn't say that, Pauline did, but I took the message. And he said to me, watch the film and then talk about what was most resonant to you, or something like that. And having seen the film and how it ends, I mean, the thing that really came to me was, I've done 2 tuning meditations this week. And the first was on Wednesday when I was on the stage. And then today I was in the audience doing it. And it set up this huge theme throughout Oliveros' work, and which the film brings out beautifully. And the theme is of relation and relationship. And there is this inherent relationship between the performer and the audience. And so my first question to you is really a question about the question, to also draw from Oliveros. But it's something about, yes, your relationship with Pauline and how you came to make the film and your journey with her.
Well, I moved about 10 years ago. I moved from New York City to the Hudson Valley, which is where Pauline and Ione were living. I didn't know that, actually. So really, it was, I would say it's fate that ended up making this film. When I arrived upstate, I knew that I wanted to make a feature film. I've made a lot of short films. I've edited other people's feature films. I knew I'm going to make a documentary feature. I didn't know the subject. I think 3 days after I was there, a neighbor came to me and we were talking, and when I live in the country, so this is literally like the only neighbor I can walk to. And she happens to know Pauline, and she says, you should make a film about Pauline. And so I spent a good year really diving in, expanding my knowledge of Pauline and introducing Pauline and myself via email, and sent her some of my work. And then my neighbor arranged a meeting with Pauline and Ione about a year later, and by the end of that lunch, we knew we wanted to work together. So, and they had said, we've been thinking Pauline needs a movie, which was actually the first thing I did with my neighbor. I went home and I Googled, and I was like, there's no movie about Pauline, I can't believe it. So, and then I was fortunate enough to spend 3 years before Pauline passed, just following them all around the Northeast and filming, most of what you see in the last sort of third of the film is stuff that I shot, recording sessions, live performances, auditions, book readings, a lot of stuff that wasn't even in the film. So I was really, this film, and then of course after Pauline passed, then it was, editing and research and research and research and trying to figure out how I can tell the story of, especially the 50s and 60s when nobody documented anything. They were just living in a whole different, completely different frame of mind than where we are now in the current world. And so, really this film is kind of my voyage of discovery about Pauline and trying to figure out how the heck I could fit this one person who seems like 10 different people into one film that was, not longer than 2 hours. So that's, I spent a good 5 or 6 years on editing to figure out how to do that.
Yes, the not documenting part, I loved that she was not interested in building a career, but really a community from which was, it was like a wellspring from which everything flowed. But I was also thinking that when we met so briefly before the screening, I got a hint of this wellspring that you get from Ione as well, even via Zoom, which is the only way that I've met her. And it seems like you've been touched by this experience and changed maybe by that working relationship with them.
Yeah, well, it's definitely, especially as an artist, I'm a musician as well, and I think that, just this idea of everything that you do can be for the community, kind of like removing, in a sense, removing yourself a little bit from the equation. And most importantly, as Pauline shows you, you can do that without compromising. So I think a lot of times people think, oh, if I want to please the people, I have to compromise. And no, you don't have to do that. You just have to find the path. And Pauline is not kidding when she built a community. I've shown this film all over the world, and about 50 more screenings in the works, and I haven't tried to get a single one of them. Every single screening I've had has been people reaching out to me, tracking down my email, contacting me on Instagram, and then, you know, people locally, like Sarah, you know, helping to make things happen. And this, yeah, you know, I think I always, there's a lot of things about Pauline that I had within myself that I wasn't, and Marta and I discussed this earlier, you know, I wasn't able to kind of define it, and she really helped me to do that. And when you hang out with her, it's especially because she's very, very, you know, I mean, you see it on screen, obviously, her personality comes, you know, is very powerful. But she's just so humble and welcoming and has time for everybody. And, you know, I just felt that way with her from the very first second, and, you know, tried to take that with me.
It really is like she's guided by an internal sun, you know, the uncompromisingness that you talk of, but then the way that she finds the path, you know, how do you tell this story? And I noticed that you use these listening questions, so it's almost like you're allowing yourself to be guided in an improvisatory manner. And so I wanted to open up the conversation to you, Marta, if, you know, how you engage with this methodology. And also I was wondering, you know, there's something about the in-betweenness and the dedication to the in-betweenness that Pauline had that I find so compelling and is obviously so incredibly creative.
Yes, I totally feel everything that Pauline is saying very deeply, and when you listen, which is a universal act, and is an act of activism, like she says, you become a medium. You become a medium for yourself and also for others. In terms of when, for example, when working on music that is played by others and responding to it, then you become this vessel which is processing what's happening in the present and informs the future. So you become, you make yourself sort of a liquid form, and in the way you can start shaping yourself in such a free way that is so liberating. And that's how personally I feel, and that's what drew me to music in the first place, when I first encountered the first mixing desk, and I realized that this can shape sound, and sound which is something which is seemingly intangible. We can't touch it, but we all feel it, and we all feel it so strongly, and you don't need to know notation to feel it or to understand it. And that to make sound is democratic per se, and sometimes it gets dressed up as this, you know, sort of difficult thing to access sometimes, but it shouldn't be. And what I admire of Pauline is also the fact that she always actively tried to make sound so democratic and so accessible, and so, you know, collaborative, because that's the true nature of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and when she invited Tarek, is it Tarek, to do the, what do you call it when you wave the, not a conductor, to conduct her piece.
Robert, yeah.
Robert, sorry, yeah. I found that extraordinary. I mean, that was her mission in a way, to change and create new social relations and roles through this matrix of sound.
And that, you know, that was composing for her. So that piece was, you know, the biggest choices that she made in that composition. I mean, there were other things involved, but what really made that piece was she told the musicians to leave their own instruments at home, and she chose Robert to conduct the piece. And that's, you know, that for her is composing. It's a lot more than, like Marta said, it just becomes this more democratic thing. Like she says in the film, you know, a virtuoso is not just someone who's really good at their instrument, it's someone who's really good at their instrument and has access to their imagination. She's always very, you know, every time she said virtuoso, she would stress that, and you even hear her in the film kind of, you know, in her way, admonishing these well-trained musicians for being too well-trained, and telling them to play out of tune. And You know, she had that from, and you even see it in the Pieces of Eight piece with the bust of Beethoven and the weather vane as the conductor, right? I mean, she and her colleagues, you know, they were entering into a world, you know, and by her colleagues, we're talking about Steve Reich, Terry Riley, you know, pretty much every major conductor, you know, every major composer besides Philip Glass, who wrote the language of contemporary classical music, was there together. And all of them were like conductor. You know, they were just done with these rules that have been around for hundreds of years and made music this elite thing that was separate from the people, you know, the audience and the performer. And she, you know, managed over 30, 40, 50 years to really just break that down completely.
And hearing you talking this way about conduction brings to mind the, you know, what happens in physics, where you conduct energy, and that's exactly part, you know, what her Tai Chi practice was about, and the way that you spoke so beautifully about being like a liquid, and how, yes, you become a medium and you channel something.
Yes, and I think in that way, you know, Pauline also put into practice what I strongly believe in, that when it comes to music and to sounds, it's not about yourself only. You are, you know, as you say, we are conducting, and through us, we're conducting, making something which is bigger than the sum of its parts. I think when we're playing or constructing music, you know, is not down to us and like to put as much of us into the sound that we're making, but when collaborating, especially when improvising with other people, is about creating something which then becomes its own identity. And that identity is not me, is not you, but is all of us together. And then that's what we're feeling. That's what we're feeling with an ensemble. And that's not just an ensemble on stage, but it's also the ensemble which are the people involved into that performance, because that's as important, I think, than what's happening on stage.
And it doesn't have to be a stage either. I mean, Pauline, in addition to playing with the, you know, well, she performed solo a lot, but she always played with the space. Every performance, you see her, she sort of sits there for 2, 3, 4 minutes and just listens before she starts to play. And she's, you know, interacting with the space. And I mean, I was fortunate enough to you know, do recording sessions for Pauline and see her perform enough. I never, ever, ever saw anybody talk at all about what they were going to play. It was always a reaction to what was going on. And there's a great story that Pauline tells. She was doing a solo performance, and I think it was in Vienna. It was in like a church, and you know, you could sort of hear the traffic noise outside. And after the concert, someone comes up to her and says, "How did you know exactly when that fire engine was going to go by?" And that's sort of like a perfect example of how, you know, she knew because she was listening, you know.
I love the part where she's also saying that she likes to listen to the sounds that people usually ignore. And throughout, I was thinking that there is, you know, there's such a potential for this to all become very anarchic. And yet it's not. It has its own internal sense of order and rhythm as well, which keeps it all together and in harmony.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, Pauline's music is, you know, someone said accessible, but, you know, it's not really that accessible. I saw her joke when I first met her when she was in her 80s that it's only recently that she was able to play her music in public. You know, she really, you know, she never compromised, and she struggled a lot, and obviously she built a great career, but it was really in the last decade that she had a lot of hope because of young people coming out and being interested in her music and interested in experimenting with sound. And, you know, I mean, her music is vast, obviously, and there is stuff like the Deep, Deep Listening record, which is extremely accessible and a great entry point to Pauline. But, you know, the electronic music is tough. You know, it's not for everybody. So she, you know, I think this is what I mean about her not compromising. She's like making music for the masses, but doing it exactly the way she wants, rather than trying to guess what people want, I think is the way of putting it.
I guess the world will catch up. I mean,
Yep.
she was, years ahead of everyone else. And I think being that bold and uncompromising is so inspiring to the younger or the people who are looking for their own way to sort of to play and what they decide to play, because I love that joke. She said, well, when I say that I play the accordion, people sort of look at me strange, and I love that because it's not about the instrument. I play tape machine, and people sometimes look at me strange when they ask me what's your instrument. I say tape machines. But is that an instrument? I say, well, anything is an instrument you want it to be. So I love that, and I think her attitude creates the courage that people need nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, she and all of her colleagues at the San Francisco State Music Center, I mean, they had careers. I mean, Morton was playing with the San Francisco Symphony. Pauline was playing French horn in orchestras and symphonies and teaching French horn. And they just dropped it completely because they wanted to hear new sounds. I mean, that's what it was all about. I mean, not in the film, I mean, sort of there, but, the Buchla synthesizer was invented at the San Francisco State Music Center. It wasn't an earlier cut of the film, but Pauline never, it wasn't really her thing. She learned it when she had to at Mills College, but, her instrument was the tape machines. But for those of you who know what a Buchla box is, it's a synthesizer that doesn't look like an instrument. They were not, there was a couple that were coming out, but they were based on keyboards, and so these guys were interested in, as Mort used to say, painting with sound. And they wanted to create sounds that hadn't been heard before. And at that point, because of the rigidness of professional musicianship and what was expected, it wasn't coming from musicians, so they had to search elsewhere for that. And I think that's like, that's an amazing way to, as an artist, to sort of, first of all, it takes a lot of courage, but in their case, it really paid off. And now you have, people like Marta who play the tape machine, and, which is what Pauline did too. Everything, Pauline never cut tape. Everything she did was a performance on tape, which is really interesting too.
Yes, so this commitment to playing and to experimenting, involving the entirety of one's body, and it makes sense completely that later she progresses to integrating, feminist work and group work, and this, her own system of healing in a way, which is very much about bringing together all these different things and then creating a new sort of container for it to carry on. And I'm thinking that when I said earlier about conducting and relating that to physics, but of course sound is immaterial, and so that's where the quantum listening comes from. So quantum listening as being the theory of the practice of deep listening, but the subtitle of quantum listening is from theory to practice, practice.
Yeah, and Pauline was, she had that dialed into a way that for me was just kind of mind-boggling. Like, because I would, she would be there, this personality you see on screen, she's like that all the time, just laughing and very personable, and she loved food. She'd be like scarfing a sandwich and doing Facebook on her phone. She was a big, embraced social media, and telling a joke to somebody, and then literally like 3 minutes later, she's on stage, and she's just there in that space. And I asked her, how do you do that? And that's what she said: practice, practice, practice. Now I know how to get into, deep listening like that. And that's, I can't do that. That's why if you ever take a deep listening workshop, one of the things that you saw some of the physical type of activities, they were doing this kind of thing, and, slapping, moving their arms around. It comes from Tai Chi, most of it. They do that for like 45 minutes before they even start trying to listen. And it really, really helps. I've done those workshops, and it's amazing. But she had, trained herself to an extent where she didn't, even need that anymore. Like, she could really just turn her brain immediately and be in that space of listening, which is why I think everybody always had this feeling like she's listening to me, like no one's ever listened to me before. And it's probably true.
And so I guess, you know, artistically, I think you mentioned it in the film as well, it's very much an attunement to the self as a way of being able to attune to your environment and all these other people around you. And then quantum listening in a nutshell is, you know, listening to listening and being able to listen to many different sounds at the same time. And, you know, it strikes me that we're sitting here today after the heaviest night of bombing in Gaza last night. And, you know, when I was working on this book, I was editing Ion's introduction around the time that Russia invaded Ukraine. And Ione in her introduction is talking about how she's listening to the sounds of war from her TV and some drilling on the street down the road from her. And although this doesn't resolve anything that's happening in the world, something resolves within her and gives her greater capaciousness to be able to hold all of this stuff going on around her. And is that healing, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's, you know, as Pauline, you know, says in the film, that, you know, the sonic meditations was, you know, there's a lot of reasons, but a big reason was the Vietnam War and what she was seeing. And, you know, as you can imagine, you know, violence and human discord was really, you know, a big issue for Pauline. And I think she saw that, you know, this, not only deep listening, but art and artists as a way to build community, and building community builds understanding, and that's how we avoid, you know, violence and strife. And, you know, I think that's why I'm hoping that everybody in the world can see this movie, not just because I made it, but because I want Pauline's, you know, like she does have an anecdote, you know, an antidote for a lot of what's going on in the world. And I mean, one thing for me that's really huge is technology. You know, I think right now what I see is, you know, technology is going into this direction where it creates isolation and separates people. And Pauline just shows this really clear path to a better way, you know, where we can use technology to connect people and to open up opportunities. And, you know, just this pervasive attitude of how through connection, and specifically in her case around the idea of sound and listening, that, you know, we can find peace on earth, as Ione says at the end of the film.
I'm going to open it up to the audience in a second, but at first I just wanted to see if, Marta, you wanted to respond to that with your work and production.
Yeah, so production per se, sometimes I get asked, what is production after all? And I always say that the most important thing in a studio and the most valuable instrument is empathy. Because empathy is at the very start of listening, and listening is never passive, nor is empathy. Empathy is always active. And that builds connection, to understanding, to be on the same level as the other people in the studio, and to be able to be on the same page and understand what their vision is and what your vision is of their vision. So the act of listening to the listening. And to become in tune with each other, like we were doing at the end of the film. And not always in tune, but also out of tune, because it's that you create harmonies, right? And dissonance creates more interesting sounds. So a lot of the work in a studio, I believe, you know, like Pauline did, she mastered her instruments, and then she was able to improvise. You need to know your instruments. You know, there is a big engineering knowledge that I feel has allowed me to be free. So knowledge did free me, so that I could then go and improvise and feel my way through a session, allowing me to listen to my feelings more than the worries of thinking, is the microphone buzzing, is that working, is that compressor plugged in? So once you master all of that, it's like a language. You start learning it when you're a child, and then you're able to convey the depth of an emotion. And then sometimes you don't have to prepare for it, because when you do, then sometimes it diminishes that act of, you know, that beautiful raw moment in where you maybe like in a studio capturing something that you weren't expecting, or maybe when you're talking to someone, you just come to the conclusion that you both weren't expecting in a conversation. So that's what I'm a fan of in the studio too, is being able to create an environment that allows everyone to feel free, and then make sure that technically, the mics are recording. And then when you know it, when something is special, because everyone turns around and we all look at each other and we feel that that was special. And then that's when you know that you've done something that is worth existing or listening to again, and never listen to it too much. Otherwise you'll spoil it, It's like when you're holding a flower for too long, it's sort of sometimes it just falls apart. So is that beauty. I think also really admire what Pauline said, is I don't practice before I go on stage, and it's beautiful because then she becomes the protagonist truly, because she feels it right there. And I believe that 100% too.
Well, that's the magic, isn't it? And her greatest instrument, or her greatest technology in a way, is really her consciousness. And that's very quantum, it's very alchemical, that the practitioner and the instrument, or the object and the observer, the perceiver, the observed, the observer, they change each other and are changed and transformed through the act of engagement. So maybe that's might be a good place to open it up for questions.
Yeah, speaking of engagement.
Yeah, lots of questions. Pauline opened up lots of questions. Does sound have consciousness? Can you listen beyond the edge of your imagination? All of these beautiful questions. So if anyone has any that can follow that, then.
I have two questions. So I can see the intersectional approach of Pauline, like she collaborated with her partner, doing incredible productions with Black artists, and of course with the disabled communities, deaf communities, also like women groups, collectives. I would like to know more about her collaborations or like engagement with the queer community, with the LGBT community, like gay and lesbian, transgender communities. If there is anything explicit in that, in her work. And also you said you went to her deep listening retreat, so I'm very curious, probably many people are, about like how were they? Like what did they entail basically?
I'll answer the second one first. Sadly, I did not go to a retreat. I have done a workshop, which is more of a one-day thing. I wish I had gone to a retreat. So all I have is, what is in the movie. I mean, there's more, but I think you get a pretty good idea of, at least a third-person idea of that. I mean, she obviously Pauline embraced her sexuality from a young age and didn't make a secret of it, and you can only begin to imagine what that must have been like in the 1950s, surrounded by a bunch of men in suits. But she did not really directly address that in her work. A lot of people, attribute that to her work, but she told me, so for example, you hear it, but her most famous piece, electronic music piece, is called Bye Bye Butterfly. And it contains probably what's, maybe with the first use of like what we would now call a sample, which is an aria from Madame Butterfly. And that has been written about as some like feminist statement. And Pauline was adamant. I had this idea, I wanted to add music. I grabbed a record, I put it on, and that's what it was. So she, I don't think, a lot of the stuff she didn't really direct, she in her work, because of this, like you said, she wanted to appeal to all groups. This inclusivity meant that she didn't really want to make pieces that were directly for or about one type of person. I mean, if that makes any sense. There's, probably her most kind of overt kind of feminist statement, and not, there's some crossover into, obviously, the idea of, you know, LGBTQ, is she wrote a piece in the New York Times, and in 1970, called "Don't Call Them Lady Composers," in which, well, you know, she had complained for a long time that there was like a dictionary of composers that was put out every year by some publisher. I guess back then it was a big deal, and there was no women in it. And she would complain about that and complain. So finally they added that and they called it Lady Composers.
You know what's sad
So,
is that
yeah,
I still quote that nowadays when I get asked to do panels for women producers.
Women producers.
Please don't call them women producers.
Yeah, I think this is a good point. So she, you know, she really, you know, she was not into identity politics, I guess. You know, she wanted things to be open. But even in that piece, in which she does go on at length about how women have been marginalized in the music world, and if you look it up online, you can find it. And you know, it's pretty sad that a lot of the stuff she said in 1970 is still true today. I mean, it's gotten better because of people like Pauline. But even in that piece, at the very end, you know, her final statement is she wants a world where all people are treated equally. So, you know, I think, yeah, I mean, you know, she didn't really directly address that in her pieces. That's my takeaway.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, in the front row, please. Thank you.
I mean, one thing about Pauline in terms of that kinds of thing is she just led by example. So I spoke to people she was in San Diego in the 70s. I mean, that was like ground zero for, what was called back then women's liberation, which is an absurd statement if you think about it now. You know, when I talked to her colleagues back then, they all said Pauline was there already. Like when the movement started, she was the example of what other women wanted to achieve. And, you know, like she was there. Like we were trying to get to a place where Pauline, she didn't need a movement. And I think that's how she's been all throughout her life, is leading, whether it's LGBTQ or women or people with disabilities. It's always by leading by example.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a question for you. Would you be interested to do another film similar to this one? For me, you give a really beautiful place for Pauline, but Pauline was not the first. I think Eliane Radic was one of the first composer from the concrete in France, from the concrete movement, concrete music. And will you be interested to develop more this idea of giving space for other countries, like others? Not just the West, basically.
Yeah, I mean, this, that's kind of a difficult question. I don't think I'll make a movie like this soon, number one, because I just don't want to make a movie with so much archival. It's really a pain in the butt. It's a lot of work, and it's very expensive. I mean, half my budget went to that stuff. When I originally, like, this is not like the film I didn't think I'm going to make this sort of biopic that's kind of tells a person's life story. And even with this film, I tried for ages to find a way to kind of honor Pauline's experimental nature more in the film. I tried to come up with ways to do it in a nonlinear fashion, and it just nothing worked, because her life is really like one thing leads to another, leads to another. So if you jump right to deep listening without knowing about electronic musician, her electronic music, without knowing about sonic meditations. So in short, I think my next film will probably be something that where I do pretty much all this filming, and it would not be as kind of straightforward as this. I hope that other people will do it, because I think these stories like really, really need to be told. It's true Pauline was not the first. She might first in America, but as she says in the film, I mean, they were doing that in Europe before her. And I mean, there are films, there's Sisters with Transistors, which you guys know, which I think she has shown here before. you know, that tells a lot of those stories. I mean, that's like 10 minutes on Pauline. That's why this film is necessary. But yeah, so the short answer is probably not.
I think that you should make the film. that would be the Pauline thing to do,
Yeah,
maybe.
that's right, exactly. If you want to do it, and do it all the way.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, Marta. Thank you so much to all of you for coming this evening, and thank you to Doc and Roll for hosting us.
Yes, thank you so much, Doc and Roll. You guys are amazing. Barbican, thank you all. We'll be around outside if you have more questions that we didn't get to. Feel free to approach. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, and if anyone wants to buy a copy of Quantum Listening, they're available for sale at the Doc and Roll desk outside.
And that is on Sarah's publisher, which is Ignota Books.
Ignota, yeah. So much more to do.
Thank you so much, guys. That's great.